Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1942 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Greer Garson won for her performance in Mrs. Miniver. But why did she beat fellow nominees Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell, and Teresa Wright? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 15th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1942. We'll be discussing why Greer Garson won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up in this Best Actress race. And my guest today is one of my absolute faves, was on the show many times for the Best Picture series and some bonus episodes. Please welcome back to the show from Next Best Picture, Casey Lee Clark.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, happy to be talking classic films with you again, Casey.
Always.
Well, before we get started here on 1942, let's just talk about Best Actress as a category. And my first question for you, Casey, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
It's hard to pick just one. I'm gonna cheat a little bit.
Oh boy, okay.
And give three real quick.
All right.
All right. Only because
some people give like five, so
yeah, and I've been listening. It's like some of these have been brought up before. I don't need to,
right.
dig into it. I mean, the first one that I think about is Elizabeth Taylor and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. From the perspective of just, I love that film and that play so much. But also I'm a sucker for very like over the top performances like that, but done very well like that. I think also it's one that in the context of her career up to that point is very surprising. But then I think in retrospect, once we see like kind of her in her later life, in her gladiator moment, that it kind of feels right. But I think, remembering where she was in her career at that point, it's such a major performance, especially just for her as an actress in general. I also love Jane Fonda in Clute. That's a big one for me. I love that movie in general. I think she's just so cool. And there's a lot of complexities to that character and her performance. It's always one that's stuck with me. And I can't name my favorites and not name the one from my favorite movie of all time, Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs, which I think is such an interesting Best Actress win. It's so against what we think of as like just an Oscar win in general. But I think her subtlety, I think also, and the whole film does this, but just the character of Clarice Starling as this very strong but also vulnerable woman without feeling like it's putting on anything or feeling like it's trying to be like, look at this woman do these things. It's like she just does them. And she, it's, maybe one day the lambs will stop crying and she can move on. And it's, right. For me, it's a performance I'll always go back to. And it's one that sticks with me so much. And I think also just it's such a cool win because it's not like a lot of other wins, and that's what I love so much about it.
Yeah, those are three excellent picks, and I do think there's a slight similarity in just how all three of them really excel in the strength and the vulnerability of those characters. So yeah, very nice. And my other question, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
I mean, everyone's going to say that it's Judy Garland, and they're right.
Many people have, yes.
They're right. And I still haven't seen The Country Girl, so I can't speak to Miss Grace Kelly, but from the perspective of, Judy Garland at A Star Is Born, it's like an all-timer performance, and she's also my favorite actress ever, so it's an extra crushing blow on that one. But another one that I haven't heard mentioned, just because I think this category is so stacked for me, is 2017. I think Frances McDormand is quite good in Three Billboards, but in hindsight, she'll have Nomadland a few years later. She had already won for Fargo. For me, that was Saoirse's time. I think that her and Lady Bird, it's my favorite performance of hers. I know that picking a winner of that category, it's one of the best actress lineups ever. But for me, Saoirse and Lady Bird is just like, she does such a good job with her accent work. And I think it's very easy to play somebody that's likable. And I think that, she has the tough job of playing a real teenager who's selfish and flawed and makes a lot of mistakes and can be not very nice at times. And I think, but also have these very, heartbreaking, vulnerable moments. And I think that, and be very funny. I think that it's just one of those performances that has stuck with me since that film has come out, and seeing just all of her other work, it stands out to me against her other work as well. So I just think that, I wish it could have been done different. I wish Lady Bird could have won an Oscar. That would have been good. But,
yes.
That one in particular is one where I'm like, if I could change that, I would.
Yeah, it's funny you mention the sense of it, her being her time. I sort of feel like that's been the case for the last 3 nominations she's had for me personally.
Yeah.
Where, like, with Brooklyn, I feel like that's such a luminous, classic sort of Best Actress kind of performance to me. And Lady Bird, she's really stretching there. I agree. And that's definitely one of my top, and would have preferred her over Frances there too. And honestly, Little Women was for me the one that really just felt like it was a crystallizing of exactly who Saoirse Ronan is as an actress, and felt like that could have been a narrative we could have gone with too, but it weirdly hasn't happened yet, and I'm wondering if it will happen. I hope so.
I hope it does. I feel like, it
rarely she still has time,
but it's, it takes, how often does someone win for their best performance, So it's something we have to accept.
Right. Well, interesting transition, because maybe we could have the discussion that maybe Greer Garson wins for her best performance. I don't know. We'll see. But let's transition here to talking about the 15th Academy Awards. The nominees were Bette Davis for Now Voyager, Greer Garson for Mrs. Miniver, Katharine Hepburn for Woman of the Year, Rosalind Russell for My Sister Eileen, and Teresa Wright for The Pride of the Yankees, with the winner being Greer Garson. So before we break down all of these performances, what are your overall thoughts on this lineup?
So I hadn't seen any of these films before this viewing. I was relatively familiar with them, some more than others, obviously. But I think they're all relatively good. There's no performance in here that's downright bad. I wouldn't say that at all. There's some that I like more than others, more specifically probably within their characters and like their screen time and things like that. But overall, I had a good time watching all of these, and I overall like all of these performances.
Wow, that's very good. I think this lineup is okay.
Let me rephrase that. I like all of them. I wouldn't call any of them my favorite nominees or winners of even the 40s.
Right.
But I don't think any of them are bad.
Yes, that's probably accurate. Yeah, for me, it's a lot like the 1941 lineup, which we just talked about, where I think we have one or two good to great ones, and everyone else is decent.
Yeah.
Some interesting stuff going on here with Greer really reaching her peak, and Bette Davis with her 5th nomination in a row. Katharine Hepburn with her first film with Spencer Tracy. We have Rosalind Russell getting her first nomination, and then, with Teresa Wright here becoming one of the few people to get 2 acting noms in the same year. Lots of different narratives to talk about, even if I'm not as crazy about a few of these performances, but we'll get into it. Ready to jump right in?
Ready.
Okay, well, let's start how we've started the past 4 episodes with Bette Davis. Okay. Bette Davis for Now Voyager. So this is already her 6th official nomination. 7th if you count her unofficial one for Of Human Bondage. She still has a few more nominations to go, so we're not done talking about her yet, but this is the end of her streak of nominations. But this was a role that was sought out for Irene Dunne and Norma Shearer and other actresses of this time. But this is another example of her really fighting for this role. and winning, as she does. It's just funny with how much she had proven herself by this point. She was still in this position where she had to look out for herself and really go toe to toe with the studio. And this is also Bette Davis here doing a pretty early version of the D-glam, at least for the first 20 minutes or so. And she's playing a young spinster named Charlotte Vale, who is a member of a wealthy British family led by this matriarch played by Gladys Cooper. Charlotte is the only daughter, and her mother really treats her horribly and is constantly belittling her. And eventually Charlotte just has a breakdown and she's sent to a sanitarium. She gets there, she gets better, quote unquote better. We don't really see like how it happens, but in theory gets better. But she's able to leave, and she goes through this big makeover and looks much more glamorous. And she goes on a cruise, and she meets a man named Jerry, played by Paul Henry, and they have a connection, they bond, and it turns into a romance. And yet he's also married, so that complicates things. There's more plot after that, but maybe we'll talk about it as we discuss this performance. Casey, tell me your thoughts here on Bette Davis, first of all, and what you think of her in this film.
Well, I'm such a big fan of Bette Davis. I mean, one of, I'd say, probably the top, old Hollywood actresses. And with now Voyager, if you had watched this film like in a vacuum, if it had been your first Bette Davis, you'd be shocked at her other performances. It's so completely different from, specifically, I would say, like her most iconic roles. I mean, like, you think All About Eve, you think Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, even things like Jezebel and Non-Human Bondage, these more like darker, meaner characters. And with now Voyager, she's so like sweet. I think it's probably the nicest character I would think of her playing. Like, you, by the end, like, you want to know her, and she like has this like she's very selfless, but also I think it's also just such a unique performance and role for that time of what it says about like mental health and like attempting to like better yourself and stand up for yourself. I think that was something that really stuck with me. I really like this performance a lot. I think it took a bit for me to get going with it. I'm not as crazy about the beginning. I find it very over the top, both in like her specifically, but also just the filmmaking in general. But once she has her makeover and is on the cruise and it's this completely different side of her, and everything with the romance and also her relationships with a lot of the other characters, I fell in love with this performance.
Nice. Yeah. Looking back, I feel like I pretty much praise all of her performances that she was nominated for, and even if I wasn't like super excited about them, I still had a lot of positives that I talked about. And while I do think there's a lot of good stuff from the first half of her nominations that she got, this right here, I think, is Bette Davis at her best.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason, I think, is because she's really treading into this newer territory that we definitely don't often see from her, as you said. Typically, she's really in these more devious parts, which is very fun to watch. But I think after a while, even that can feel a little bit too much like she's just being typecast. And I understand her desire to really try something new and challenge herself, which she definitely does here. This is such subtle work from her, even though this is very much a melodrama. She's just providing so much depth of character here from, I would say, from the start. Just the opening scene of her very hesitantly walking down the stairs and just barely even saying a word. You just really get a sense of how this woman has been so degraded all of her life and is just afraid to even express herself in any way. I guess I would sort of agree with what you're saying, in the sense of the extent to which she is made to look plain and unattractive is a little extreme, because she has like the messy hair and the eyebrows and these like bizarre glasses and the dress and the shoes, and I feel like it has a bit of a shock value for the audience. I was actually reading that the trailer for the film didn't show this part of the film. So when people went to see it, they were just like, what's happening? Who even is this
Oh
actress
my god.
in like the opening 20 minutes here? But yeah, pretty effective, but I also do find it to be overdone, I would say.
I think it's more
You know.
so I hate the mother so much, and you're supposed to, but like she's
Yeah.
so much in that opening where once it's the scene with her and Claude Rains in her bedroom when you get the flashback to kind of reveal like
Mm,
what was kind of the tipping point of getting here with her on that cruise with that sailor. That scene I think works a lot for me, and I think that's kind of the point when I was just like when I started to be won over by the film. It's more so just everything with the mother is so much.
yeah, it's very over the top. But yeah, that scene with her and Claude Rains, and she's talking about how her mother picks out her shoes and her books and everything about her life, and she has no agency, and she's talking about my mother, and it's like she's really reached this breaking point. This is a 30-something woman here who has just no confidence in herself, and I think what she does best, and this is true for all of the performances I've talked about, is to really show the audience just the psychology of what's happening in her mind. Like, I think we know from these first few scenes that just how tortured she is to be living in this place, that even if this plot and this dealing with the mother is very over the top and dramatic, she does ground it, I think, in a way that you understand her and you sympathize with her. And I am kind of wondering how much you think that the sympathy we feel for the character in the beginning is just due to these circumstances that she's in, or if you think that Betty here is doing something as a performer to elevate beyond that kind of classic stereotypes.
Well, I think you also see just a lot of like pain in her eyes, especially again going back to that scene with Claude Rains of just like, I could have gotten out of here, but instead I'm, stuck here, and just it just feels so much like a cry for help.
Yeah. And, after she's gone to the sanitarium for like, what, 5 minutes and done some weaving and I guess gotten better. I love how much that's all just sort of completely ignored. Like the whole process of undoing like 30 years of trauma. We
Yeah,
just
there's like
don't have time to unpack all
I mean, you
that.
kind of get pieces of it throughout when I
Yeah.
forget what the Claude Rains doctor, I forget what his name is, but like she'll constantly be like, well, he says this about this. Like, she
Mm,
constantly brings up these like isms that he's told her and these like suggestions and ways of life and stuff like that.
that's true. Yeah. But
But
it
yeah,
does
it's
just
quick.
feel like it's very sudden.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do love this stunt queen moment that she has on the boat of really just truly revealing herself in the most dramatic of ways, and it's like she's so confident in herself already just with this makeover,
Hmm.
with like the fierce hat, and the looks like she's gotten her eyebrows trimmed, like
Hmm.
it's a bold lip, like it's a real moment.
Oh yeah.
And it's I feel like it's not like, oh, this is a totally different person. I mean, physically she looks very different, but I do think she still has a little bit of that hesitance that we've seen before. Like it's not totally washed away, and it comes through really in this whole section of with Jerry, and she's a little wishy-washy and she's kind of putting herself down, and she even says at one point that she's like one of the lesser people of her family, one of the lesser Vales, when he's talking about like, oh, the famous Vales of Boston, and she's very dismissive of herself in this way. That's quite revealing, I think.
Yeah, I think she does a good job of it being almost like a gradual change. Obviously, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, it's such a stark difference appearance wise, but she still seems very timid and nervous. She keeps to herself. She's kind of like apprehensive about like, opening up to him or even just like, talking to him at all and like making friends. And I think that, by the end of this trip, obviously when her family sees her, the sister-in-law and the niece, it's like this, completely different person, which side note, and I don't know why I think this, the sister-in-law weirdly reminds me of Ileana Douglas. I don't know
Oh my
why.
god.
I thought that the whole time. I forget what I
That's
watched her in
funny.
recently where I was just like, she reminds me of her. I don't know.
I love that. Maybe a remake we could, yeah.
Yeah.
uh, but it's, yeah, I think for her it's just like these little asides that she has where it's not like she's looking at the camera and being like, this is how I'm feeling, but it's those moments where she's like, dipping her head a little bit, or she's like hiding her face from Jerry, and the camera is framed in this way where it feels like the audience is the only ones who could really see what's really going on. Like it's our little secret, essentially, what she's going through.
Yeah.
And sometimes she'll just say it, sometimes she'll just tell other people how she's feeling, but sometimes she doesn't. But I feel like the audience always knows. But what do we think about also this connection that the two of them shared? Do you find it erotic? Because there's a certain scene here of the double cigarettes.
Oh, the double cigarettes. Yes. I and it's done so much in it, but every time,
yeah,
it's like a big fan. I'm a big fan of the romance. I also, Paul and Reed, I have a crush on Victor Laszlo in Casablanca, but it's like you can't like him because you want her. You want her to be with Rick. So it's like, yeah, finally I get my Paul and Reed, like, oh, I can like him in this one. It gives me permission.
That's true. Yes. Yeah, this is definitely one of the more famous parts of this movie, maybe one of the more iconic moments, where he has the two cigarettes in his mouth and he lights them and then gives one to Charlotte. And honestly, it's one of the hottest things I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say it. And the two of them really just sell that sort of charge that they have between each other without even having to go much beyond that.
Yeah.
Which I think is, partly just the production code, but also a testament to what can be done, even if it's not like a sex scene or even like the two of them making out passionately. It's still, you feel this intense connection between them.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we should just mention this very random moment where they get stuck in Rio de Janeiro. So they're sort of running around Rio de Janeiro and they're in this cab of this Brazilian guy who doesn't understand English, and they get into a car crash, and it's all sort of played for laughs. It doesn't really fit the tone of this movie at all. What do we make of that?
I don't know. I mean, it's, it gets them delayed, which then gets them in that little like cabin thing. I mean, that's where they kiss, basically. I mean, he kisses her, but
yeah,
it's kind of a turning point for the viewer, I should say. I mean, we know that there's obviously romance afoot, but that's kind of like, I think a big moment there.
Yes, and I can understand, like, you've been through this bizarre, traumatic moment of almost dying in this car crash in Rio de Janeiro, and that can sort of bond you, but I just feel like the tone of the scene is very strange and doesn't fit what's happening in this movie at all.
It's one thing if they're just like delayed in the cab and it's, the lost in translation of not understanding what this man's saying, and then it's, the seriousness of the car crash is a bit much. That's the part tonally. Like if it was just some little comedic brief scene, I think it'd be one thing, but
yeah. But we get the next portion of the film where she's returning home, and once again we have her mother treating her horribly and putting her down and criticizing all her choices and her clothes, and we actually start to see how much confidence that Charlotte is now gaining after this whole experience of being with Jerry, who is someone who actually does treat her decently and like a human being, and realizing that she doesn't have to take it from anybody, including her own mother. And there's the moment where her mother insults her, and it looks like Charlotte is going to say something, but she sort of thinks better of it and tries to be the bigger person. And then that only sort of leads to more and more moments where she's really thinking about like finally standing up. She's also sort of feeling sorry for herself again and regressing into that older Charlotte where the body language is much heavier. But then over time, she does realize how appreciated she is by other people, and like, wait, like I really don't have to take this anymore. It really is standing up for herself. And I feel like she just really makes that character growth really come across, and is really blending that like initial weakness that she has with also this newer strength, which is just all in the way that she carries herself with so much more of a poise and just the facial gestures. it's more of a balancing act she's doing once she's back home again. I think this is the trickiest sort of part of the film for her to really figure out what to do with it, but she manages to make it work.
Yeah, completely.
She gets engaged to this local guy who's not all that interesting, but they're attending a function and she sees Jerry again, and it's all filmed in this very beautiful way where it really feels like everyone else at the party has just disappeared and it's just the two of them. And yeah, I mean, I have to say, having done this series for a number of episodes now, like the male love interests aren't always the most thrilling here, and they don't always have the best chemistry, but I think these two are really kind of electric together, especially in these moments.
Yeah, and I like his character. I think that, they give him a lot of interesting things to play with between his background, his unhappy marriage, his children. I think there's a lot there than, it's a lot more of an interesting story, likewise with her part of it as well.
And then there's this whole third act section where Jerry has been mentioning the trouble that he's been having with his daughter, Tina. And then later on, we have Charlotte just really upset over what's happened with her mother and is deciding to check back into the sanitarium. And she actually sees Tina there. Interesting coincidence. And becomes a mother figure to her. And really, like, from these nominations, this is another side of Betty that I truly haven't seen of her, actually being like a good motherly figure to someone.
Yeah.
And I think it works.
Yeah, like I was saying with the romance aspect, it's a direction you don't expect this film to go, and it tackles these like themes and feelings that you don't expect, but it ends up being quite sweet and beautiful. I think there's the moment when her and Jerry reunited, and Tina's had her own little transformation, and she comes down the stairs in her party dress, and I couldn't help but like tear up.
Yeah.
It's like it's like all very sweet and beautiful, and it's like, not an angle you expect a love story to go of, I can't be with you, but if I, treat your child like my own, that's me being closer to you. It's like, it's very beautiful and devastating.
Yeah, because I think a lot of it is that she sees a lot of herself in Tina, who's this very downcast kind of girl who doesn't really fit in. And the scenes that they have together are just so sweet and simple, and she ends up essentially adopting her. And yeah, what I find really striking about this ending is how mature it is, like how it really is presenting this mature relationship of two people who realize they can't be together, but they're gonna make something work. They'll find a way to stay in each other's lives. And it's so bittersweet in a way that feels very modern.
Yeah.
I would say, this is not something you expect from a classic Hollywood film necessarily of this time.
Yeah, I think it's something that makes this film, out of all five of them, just stand out so much.
Yeah, so I mean, I really like this performance, and I don't know even if I got the first time I saw it, just everything she was doing here, but this time, just really focusing on her performance, I was very impressed by just how much feeling she gives to this role, and you really get a sense that she just cares for this character so much. I feel like with the more villainous roles, like, she really reveled in that mode, but it's these more challenging roles, I think, that really probably excited her and drove her more as an actress. Maybe I'm just projecting, I don't know, but it seems like she cared about this one.
Yeah.
So that's good to see. And just reading a review from the time, we had the New York Times saying, Miss Davis plays the young woman, highlighting her progress to emotional maturity with the decision and accuracy of an assured actress.
Yeah.
So, yes, she was very acclaimed for doing something a little different that we hadn't seen before, and no surprise that she gets this nomination. Any other thoughts on Bette Davis before we move on?
No, I think we covered everything.
Yes. Okay. Well, bittersweet to be leaving this Bette Davis train, but we'll have a break of one episode before she's nominated again in
I was gonna
1944.
say
So
there's still more to
yeah.
come.
Oh yes, and some very iconic ones to come. Okay, so speaking of iconic, let's go next to Katharine Hepburn in Woman of the Year. So here we have the fourth Oscar nomination for Katharine Hepburn, and this is a big moment for her career because it's the first of 9 films that she makes with Spencer Tracy, who would become her life partner. And she had sort of developed this idea for Woman of the Year with a friend of hers. She also contributed to the script, and she really helped to pitch it to MGM, and she was given the option to choose both her director and her co-star, keeping in mind that this is after the success of the Philadelphia Story, and America was very much in a position of like, we love you again about Katharine Hepburn after the box office poison stuff. So yeah, she was given a great deal, and she chose George Stevens, who had directed her for Alice Adams, and she chose Spencer Tracy here as her co-lead. And this is another project where she was very, very involved, had a big say in a lot of the decisions. Unfortunately, that didn't extend to the ending, which was reshot, but we will get to that later. But this film, it's a rom-com, and it's about these 2 journalists who work for the same paper. She's playing Tess Harper, who is a world-renowned writer and considered one of the more influential women in America. And so Spencer Tracy's playing Sam Craig, who is a sports writer, and they're brought together when she makes this claim about baseball and how it should be put on hold until the war is over, which just enrages him, and they end up meeting, but they hit it off, and they fall in love and kind of impulsively get married, after which point they realize that they're both a little too stubborn, and they get into quite a few conflicts with each other. And quite a bit of it, I would say, stems from him not really loving the idea of being the beta in the relationship. So it's a real like battle of the sexes kind of movie. So thoughts on Katharine Hepburn, the legend, and her performance here?
I mean, yeah, it's very much an iconic type of Katharine Hepburn performance. I think I kind of knew what I was getting into when I watched it, and I got that, which is not a bad thing by any means. She's great at what she does, especially in this mode. What I think stands out the most about this film is her and Spencer Tracy's connection. I mean, for me personally, I'm like, you can see them falling in love on screen, particularly with her, the way that she looks at him. I'm like, oh, that's real. There's something about a lot of those beginning romance scenes where there's something about it that feels different than your average movie stars, and knowing that they would, be each other's loves of their lives for the rest of his life. I think that you feel that through the screen. I think they also just have really great comedic chemistry in a lot of different types of scenes. This film had the disservice. I had seen Adam's Rib before, which comes out a few years later and is kind of a similar battle of the sexes, but I think that film does it a bit better. I think they kind of refine the formula with that one, whereas this one, it feels a little more, it's a very meandering movie plot-wise.
Yeah.
I think about other screwballs, or even like, I think about like Bring Up Baby or even Adam's Rib, where like it's a concrete like concept and idea, and that, or a situation, if you will, and then that kind of throws out. Whereas like this, it's like, it's kind of about them being journalists that then fall in love, but it's also a lot of these everyday things, and some of that can be entertaining, but some of it can kind of be like, where is this going, like, structurally?
Yeah.
It also has one of the most horrifying scenes I've ever seen, which is her trying to cook. I wanted to text you about this because I was like, what? I could not get, I mean, it's maybe her best scene in the movie, just because I am in such disbelief at what she's doing. I think at one point she doesn't realize that you keep the yolks in things when you bake them, and she starts sifting eggs.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't feel like I need to see anybody messing up in a kitchen in a movie ever again, because they're not going to top whatever is happening here.
No, this is the gold standard
And
for
it's also
sure.
just like it's so quiet and awkward in its like
Yeah, there's no
pacing.
music.
There's no music, and it's not like
Yeah.
frenetic and like crazy. It's just suddenly there's toast flying out of the toaster,
Yep.
and she's trying, and then there's just Spencer Tracy in the back just staring at her like, should I say something or should I just watch what she's
Yeah.
doing?
And this goes on for like 4 or 5 minutes.
So
Like it's so long. Yeah. A lot to unpack with that
yeah.
one, but this movie is not one that I had seen before. Actually, this is one of two that I hadn't seen before, but I had heard about the reputation of the ending and the sort of sexual battle of the sexes of it all. So I was a little bit uncertain going into this, and I think it's a decent movie. I don't think it's great. I think the rhythm is kind of off. It's not all that funny, even though it's pitched as a comedy, and there's definitely a dated element to that ending that feels very studio enforced. Not a surprise at all to read about how there were test screenings and people felt like she wasn't adequately punished enough for putting her career above everything. So they rewrote it entirely to give her that more humbling kitchen moment at the end. But as far as the performance, I think she's pretty good here. I don't love it. I don't think this is outstanding work from her. And I think a lot of it is that despite her playing what is supposed to be this sort of strong feminist hero, I think a lot of the material she has isn't all that strong. And a big part of it is this is so clearly told from the perspective of Spencer Tracy and his character. It isn't really until the last part of the film, really, where we get to see some actual substantial scenes with her just alone and figuring out what she really wants, and we're seeing her motivations. It's just there's a lot of it that's her sort of floating around a room and being charming and speaking in foreign languages and being ambitious. But the film is written in this way that he's the one reacting to all this. He's the one that you're supposed to identify with, and it doesn't really feel as that even-handed feeling as like some of the other better comedies of this era, like Bringing Up Baby, as you said, and The Awful Truth, which we talked
Yeah, I
about.
thought about The Awful Truth during it and how
Yeah,
much better that film does these types of things.
right. Where you get more of both sides coming, they both get to shine in a way, and they both have their strengths and their weaknesses. She does have that moment at the end there, but I feel like we don't get a sense really of what is actually behind this drive that she has to save the world, or even just why she wants to save this marriage that's in shambles.
I feel
basically.
like we don't get enough of like, and it's hard to, have this come across via film, but like the specifics of her career.
Yeah.
We just see her like mingling with people and giving speeches.
Yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't feel like she's a journalist. It
right.
almost feels like she's like a politician or like a diplomat or something, and like,
yeah,
like you don't.
It's very vague.
Like, I don't remember. When you see her writing, she's not even writing. She's like speaking correspondence to like her assistant.
Yeah, it's very vague what it is that she actually does and what her actual like angle of things that she writes about is. But I guess the film doesn't really expect us to care that much about it, other than just the mere fact of her being so ambitious and so important is enough without getting into the details of it. But I feel like the film is just sort of putting her at a distance, which I get from a thematic standpoint. Like, look at this woman who's so accomplished and career focused, and it's hard to really connect with her on that more personal level. But I think what happens is that we're sort of just left with her playing into the Katharine Hepburnisms, in a sense. And it's like she's going back to the old tricks of the snobby attitude, super confident, untouchable. I don't know. It's ironic that the character isn't really strong enough to really single this out as her delivering a performance as a different character like I do with Alice Adams or even The Philadelphia Story or Morning Glory even.
Yeah, I like it for what it is, but yeah, when I compare it to, again, if you haven't seen Adam's Rib, I would recommend that one. I think it does
Yeah.
this a lot better in that one. They play lawyers, and it's also a battle of the sexes thing, but I think it is a lot more even. If anything, I would
Mhm.
probably consider it more her movie. But yeah, and I think also with this one, it's so much from his perspective in the beginning, and then shifts to her, and we're expected to have this very like emotional moment with her at her father's wedding, realizing that she had her great love and lost it and how to get him back. And it's like you don't really you feel that because she's selling it emotionally, but from a story perspective, you feel like you need a bit more. I think also you just need more of their relationship because you get those early moments with them, connecting at the baseball game and stuff, but you don't I feel like it's like suddenly they're getting married
Mhm.
and like you don't see this
Yeah.
great relationship play out enough.
Right. I would agree with that. On a sort of fundamental story level, it doesn't really work, but you do also definitely feel this very intense connection that they share together. I definitely agree with you that they're really just falling in love with each other in just like the first few scenes that they have here, their first meeting even. And it's so wild just even looking at the first scene that they share where they're in their boss's office and she's sort of like looking him up and down and sort of has like this weird smile and is like it almost looks like she's about to break with how just like into him she is that it's just interesting to see her in that more of a romantic mode that we don't always see. But yeah, there's the scene after they're married and he's clearly not happy with how much he's just become second fiddle to her, and she's very gently broaching the subject of having a baby with him, and he's thrilled by this. And then there's this reveal that she's actually adopted a child, this young refugee from Greece who does not speak English. And honestly, I think from here on out it just goes in a direction of really throwing her under the bus as this kind of
Yeah.
unsympathetic person who is just lacking in basic common sense.
Yeah, and it's like, from the modern lens, and if a modern movie tried to tackle this type of film, it could, you would have a better, more nuanced take of somebody who's, a relationship where the partners aren't, communicating properly, not, she adopts a child without consulting him, like there's a way of doing that without it just being this very cut and dry, like, oh, she did bad things.
Right.
And then also just that subplot in general it's a lot.
It's a lot.
A
Yeah.
lot of him taking the kid back.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
brutal. I just even still though, I don't even really buy that she would do this. Like
Yeah.
I didn't get the sense that she would be kind of person who would just take in a refugee so that she could save their marriage. Like it felt like kind of a stretch
Yeah.
for me personally. And then when the film shows how kind he is to this child after a while and she sort of forgets about him, like it's all really setting her up, I think, as this villain here who needs to be humbled. And it's kind of unfortunate that it takes him sending the kid back to the orphanage for her to be like jolted back into reality again, and that this kid is almost like a prop
Yeah.
that these two people are using against each other rather than actually looking out for him. Definitely left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, and I don't know how intentional that was. I think part of it is intentional, but I also am kind of like skeeved out by the whole thing
Yeah.
and wish it wasn't involved.
Yeah, it's definitely a plot line that I think it hits worse now.
Yeah.
Not to imply that it probably ever worked, but I think especially now it's like, ugh.
Yeah. But we get this ending, which is of her having gone to her father's wedding and seeing this love that they share between each other, and she's tearing up, and I mean, I was Katharine Hepburn. I think has always been a very good crier, so this is I'd say a good scene for her acting wise. But then, yes, we get this ending, which is her crawling back to him after they've separated for a while and making him a breakfast, even though I guess she's never cooked anything ever.
I am
Because,
baffled at it.
yeah.
You're implied to believe that this woman is so smart, and it's just like she doesn't know. Like, you can not know the mechanics of how to cook something, but you know what's in it.
Right.
And it's like she's reading a recipe. She's reading.
It's not that complicated.
It's not that complicated. Like, you're telling me this this savvy woman has never made coffee. Like, good God.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give her this. There's kind of like a weird, like, carefree attitude that she has in this scene that does, I think, provide some laughs, where she's just kind of tossing things around.
Oh yeah, she has this mentality of just like, it can't be that hard.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll just kind of power through it and we'll see what happens.
And there is the plot line of it that, her father's very wealthy. Like, she probably never had to do these things to herself. So that is, it's not that unbelievable, especially, I think it's just now in the modern lens, like, we can't even fathom this. I mean, I know men that don't know how to cook to save their lives, but they could probably figure it out, maybe.
Yeah. But I also think a lot of the humor is sort of coming from just laughing at her and just her attempts to be a housewife, and she tells him she just wants to be his wife at this point, even just suggesting that she doesn't maybe even care about her career anymore, which is in theory supposed to show that she's grown, but it definitely feels more like a regression. And then to have him say that she can still keep her name and find balance with work and family, like, it's a nice sentiment, but if you really are just looking at the story from her perspective, it's like, here's this very successful woman who's done a lot of, I assume, good things in the world. Then she meets this guy and they get married, and things go so downhill to the point that she's begging him to just let her be what she thinks he wants her to be. And I just feel like it does a huge disservice to that character, where the original ending was more like the two of them making, like, compromises and meeting in the middle on things and just agreeing to try to make it work. Actually, kind of like the now Voyager ending, like, figuring out how to make this work. But I don't think Hepburn is really into this whole ending very much and doesn't really sell that emotional ending for her like she does with the rest of the movie. Yeah. But what do you think?
Yeah, I feel like, I even watching it, I'm just like, you don't have to, I mean, you could just scale back a bit. Like, the way every relationship is, you just need to make the other person more of a priority. But that's, that's too complicated of a concept for this movie. It has to be one or the other, which doesn't feel true at all, especially also for that character. It doesn't feel believable that she would completely give it up.
No, not at all. But apparently it's what the audiences wanted. But what do audiences know?
Yeah.
This review from the New York Times said, Miss Hepburn was the perfect actress to play this Woman of the Year, and she does so with authority and feeling. She also projects a surprising warmth, which she has not heretofore seemed to possess. Okay, rude, but...
Yeah, she's perfectly cast.
Yeah.
It's a Katharine Hepburn role.
Yeah, I can't really picture anyone else doing this. I just feel like I wouldn't say that she's never possessed a warmth in her performances before.
No.
But that's how it was written about at the time. Shall we move on to our next one?
Yeah.
Rosalind Russell, My Sister Eileen. This was Rosalind Russell's very first Oscar nomination. She would later get 3 more nominations, but sadly she never ended up winning. But before this, she had been in a lot of movies. She actually had a bit of trouble finding a studio that would treat her well, but then The Women came along in 1939, and that gave her a boost. His Girl Friday, the very next year, definitely should have been nominated for that. Now here she is in My Sister Eileen, which is sort of in that vein of the fast-talking screwball comedy that she really, I think, mastered with His Girl Friday, except At least in my opinion, this movie isn't quite as good. But it's taken from a stage play. Fun fact with this one, the role that she's playing here was actually played by Shirley Booth on the stage. We'll be
Oh.
talking about Shirley Booth next season. Come back, little Sheba.
Mm-hmm.
But this film, it's about two sisters, Ruth and Eileen, played by Rosalind Russell and Janet Blair. They are living in Columbus, Ohio, and both of them have big dreams. Ruth wants to be a writer, Eileen wants to be an actress, so they pack up and move to New York City, and they rent a not so great basement apartment, and they go out and look for work, and Ruth is trying to submit her story in this local paper and strikes up a relationship with a reporter, and he really takes an interest in her, and a lot of different men are interested in Eileen, and the two of them have to deal with people coming in and out of their apartment, people they know, people they don't know, and a lot of the action is just in these two sisters reacting to the nonsense around them and also kind of being harassed by a lot of men. So it's a comedy, but it's also kind of horrifying. Casey, thoughts on Rosalind Russell and this movie?
Rosalind Russell, innocent. I wasn't crazy about this film by any means. I
saw your Letterboxd review.
I find movies like this very stressful and like unnecessarily so. And there's just so many characters, and I don't care about any of them. The men, I kept getting confused.
Yeah, they're very interchangeable.
They're very interchangeable. Outside of the neighbor Rec, who's like clearly a distinct body type, and like the landlord, like I couldn't tell any of these men apart. Half of them, and then there's two different reporters, but it gets very complicated. There's so much going on, and like I don't care about any of it. I care a little bit about these sisters, but I kind of get over it pretty quickly. I think things happen in this movie so fast that you don't really have a chance to like sit with it and like, form an opinion or care about it. You care about it in the sense of like, you want them to live somewhere better and to like be successful because they're nice and they're good, but it's like there's not much there. It got to a point where I literally looked at the screen and just said, just stop talking. There's no moments of silence in this movie whatsoever. Everyone's just talking constantly. There's constantly things going on, and you get why it would be based on a play. There's no doubt in my mind that this is I could have told you that without knowing anything. It's so obvious, and it didn't work for me at all.
Wow.
It just wasn't my thing. As far as Rosalind Russell, I think she's good. I think she has a lot of good quips, like she does. I think she's, funny and endearing, but on the whole, I think it's more of just the writing in the film itself that makes me not care that much about this performance. There's nothing that she's doing that I dislike. I think it just kind of boils down to like, I think she does the best with what she's given.
Yeah.
But it's not, I wasn't wowed or anything.
Yeah. I like Rosalind Russell here. I've definitely loved her in a lot of other films before. This is the other film here that I hadn't seen before, so I can say that I had high expectations because I have seen, so many great performances from her. But if I'm being honest, this really doesn't come close to what I know to be her best work. And I have to admit that I definitely walked away from this one pretty underwhelmed. Probably one of the better things that she excelled at as a performer is the repartee that she has with other characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like Cary Grant and His Girl Friday obviously being like the gold standard. But she doesn't really have a strong enough scene partner to really bounce off of to really make this material really sing.
Yeah.
And it's not like she goes back and forth too much with her sister. They're always pretty much on the same side. And I also think personally that Janet Blair is not quite on her level.
No, yeah, that's the other thing is that like Rosalind Russell's just so clearly like the more standout actor of anybody in this film. And so you keep just waiting for somebody else to match her, and you never really get there. I think also it's just one of those films, and I'm sure you'll come across this throughout this series, where if it didn't have an Oscar nomination, it would just get lost to time.
If this did not have an Oscar nomination, it wouldn't exist.
Did you watch the colorized version on YouTube.
No.
That was the only thing I could find.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, don't, but like
Oh dear.
it's under the name Give My Sister Eileen, which doesn't make any sense, but I found it.
Okay.
The point is,
Maybe
we
trying
found it.
to hide from a studio.
Yeah. But yeah, it's
But
very
oh.
strange.
Yeah, I don't really think anyone that they interact with is really on her level. And I think it creates this dynamic where a lot of the humor is just throwing a bunch of shit at the wall
Yep.
and seeing what sticks. Like so many different characters coming in and out. And it's a pretty broad kind of humor that, you know, she's certainly capable of, but I don't think it's what she does best, which is just like the smart, witty one-liner, like tit for tat stuff with her scene partners. I think it's all a little too broad, and I think what happens is that there's not a lot of room for her to really find this character because there's so much that they have to react to. We sort of get that she wants to be a writer and she's very eager to make a name for herself, but I feel like it sort of just ends there.
Yeah.
Like there isn't really an arc and things are just sort of happening to her and her sister at a certain point, more so than them actively doing anything.
Yeah.
Which is why it's hard to even like look beyond the surface here because there's not anything beneath it.
Yeah, I feel like if it took away a lot of these like supporting characters and just focus more on these, I know this would probably be a different kind of movie, but of like, you know, these sisters moving to the big city and trying to find their careers and get a foot in. I feel like we start to get that, and then it just gets so sidetracked with all these other characters that we can't even, you know, get a moment of that. It's like, oh, we got to go back to the apartment. Like it's where we can't,
Right.
you know, be out in the world trying, you know, what I expected this to be of like, you know, them trying to get their career started. And it's a lot more about the neighbors and these men trying to get with Eileen and then their family. And it's just, and yeah, like some of it's funny, but it's very, very broad.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing is that the story doesn't feel like it progresses really because it sort of is just going back to the same things and even the same type of humor, and they're sort of stuck in the same place, that it's not really that satisfying as a story. But where I do think that she does get an opportunity to really stretch and show what she could do is actually in some of the few dramatic scenes in the film, like when the two of them are trying to relax on their first night in the apartment, and it's so loud and people are looking into their window and harassing them, and Eileen says that she's afraid, and we see Ruth really taking on this very protective big sister kind of role, and it's very brief, but I think she gives this look that just feels very genuine in the middle of this comedy with all the wacky hijinks. It's that moment where you do feel some sympathy for these sisters who are just in way over their heads.
Yeah.
Like they've just moved to the big city. They really haven't had any positive experiences so far. And I also think you feel a little bit of history here between them, especially when we see Ruth getting into bed with Eileen to try to make her feel better. Like that all feels at least genuine and like a actual human moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least. So, I mean, whether it's like a standout acting scene, I don't know, but I think she's decent there. But yeah, otherwise we have a lot of the screwball energy with the apartment and dealing with the neighbor and the landlord and the reporter and yeah, a lot of different men, and we have the two of them falling into these roles of Eileen trying to be very accommodating and positive with the whole thing, and Ruth is sort of on the side and making snide comments and in a way sort of playing the audience surrogate straight man kind of role, like lots of the eye rolls and the crossing her arms and disapproval and gritting her teeth and sort of mocking people. I don't know. I mean, she's definitely the one that we are supposed to relate to the most, and she has a certain charisma to her that does keep things light enough and is still giving you that sort of sarcasm sort of energy, like she's the smartest person in the room, even when she's feeling kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah, I think like the scene where you get the best out of her, one of the reporters she has the most scenes with, they go to dinner and she can't get a word in edgewise, and finally I think he said, I forget what he says to her, she's like, I haven't been able to talk all night, and she kind of just like goes off on him of
Yeah.
like, you kind of get, if this was a musical, this would be her I Want song.
Yeah.
But like I think that moment where you like finally start to see like who this character is. I mean, it's very, basic. There's nothing that very,
Yeah.
nuanced about her specifically, but it at least is a moment for her to kind of do a little bit more.
Right. And then we have those moments where she is getting some real opportunities and advancing a little bit in her career, where she spends quite a bit of time just feeling dejected because the boss at the paper doesn't want to run her stories. But yeah, this reporter is taking a liking to her and manages to make it happen eventually. And when he enters their apartment, it's like all of that sort of too cool for school sort of demeanor that she has really changes, and she freezes up kind of and doesn't want to say anything wrong or do anything wrong. And I think her body language is very expressive in those moments where, it's a little over the top, but that's what this style of film calls for. So she's working with what she has. But then later on, when she gets the call about taking on this assignment for the paper, and she answers the phone and she's like, yes, this is she. And it's like, such a contrast to what we've seen from that, cool, sarcastic type of woman that she was before. I just like these little moments where she gets to drive the scene rather than just reacting to all the crazy shit that's happening around her. Yeah, I just feel like the movie doesn't really give her the opportunities to really show that as much as I would like and what she's capable of.
Yeah.
So, and any highlights for you among the crazy neighbor stuff and like the marine fleet that randomly
I
comes in by the end?
I was entertained by the neighbors, the ones that are married but her mother can't know they're married. There's the moment when like the mother-in-law looks in the window and he says shit to her, and then he finds out after that of like, wait, that was her. That old.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's basic comedy, but it is, kind of funny.
Yeah. That is fun. And just this whole thing with the marine fleet that is entered their apartment, and they obviously want them out of the apartment, so they make like a conga line to just like get them out of the apartment. At this point I was just like, what am I even
Yep.
watching?
What am I even watching?
Like it's I felt like I was going crazy in this moment. Like I truly can't even imagine how this movie is going to end.
Yeah, and then their like the father and the grandmother just show up, even though they make such a big deal of them getting to New York and how expensive it is, and the family just shows up
Yeah,
out of nowhere.
fair point. Yep, and it's just this thing of like, there are obviously all the worst things that can happen do happen when the family is there, and they want them to move back, and there's just a little bit of conflict where they don't know exactly what they want to do, but ends up wanting to stay, and we get a moment of the Three Stooges coming in at the end.
Yep. Just however you expected this movie to end,
Yeah, truly. I'm like, yeah, that tracks.
Yeah.
What a mess. What a messy movie.
Yep.
But from the New York Times, pretty basic, but it says Rosalind Russell plays the smart sister with a delightfully dour and cynical air.
Sure.
Yeah, delightfully dour. That's how I would describe her in this movie. Yes. I did want to mention a few things here that I was reading about Rosalind Russell. She had some interesting things to say about her co-star, her sister Eileen, as it were. Her in her autobiography, this is just a quote I wanted to read, where she said, Janet Blair, the girl who was cast as Eileen, started trying to upstage me. She was new and nervous, the same way I'd been when I started, so I invited her into my dressing room and delivered a short speech about the inadvisability of the course she'd embarked on. Look, I said, you're not going to steal the picture from me because I've got the better part. The sympathy comes to me, and you're not going to get any place with what you're doing. I know all those old tricks. When you upstage me, all I do is turn my back on the camera, and then they have to come around on me full face for my close-up. So then, so then Janet Blair was just like very thankful to be getting all this advice and thanked her for being so kind. And then Roz responded, "I'm not doing it because I like you. I don't know anything about you. I'm doing it to get a good picture."
Great.
Yep. So I feel like Rosalind Russell did not have like a great time making this, but she made it work.
She made it work.
I also read that she commented on her nomination here, and she said, "Glad as I was about it, the honor put me under heavy pressure. It means too much to the studios to have their people win. I still can't think about the tension surrounding those races without breaking into a sweat." Yeah, she went on to star in the musical adaptation of this play, which was in 1953, called Wonderful Town.
Oh, yeah.
And she won a Tony for it.
It feels kind of like I know the title,
Yeah.
Wonderful Town, but I've never listened to it. I feel like I would probably like this as a musical more.
I feel like it plays better as a musical.
Yeah. I think also, even though I felt exhausted by it, I somehow wish it was longer.
Yeah.
It just feels,
I don't...
at least, other moments stretched out more than others.
Right.
For character development.
Yes, that's
probably what I meant
what
more.
I would say. Yeah, because honestly, by the time it was over, I was like, thank God.
Well, yeah, okay. More character development. Find a way to do that in the same amount of time.
Right. Make the 96 minutes better. Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to our final losing nominee, Teresa Wright, for The Pride of the Yankees. So we have our second example here of an actress getting nominated for both Best Actress and Best Supporting Actress in the same year. First being Fay Bainter in 1938. And much like Fay Bainter, Teresa Wright does win the Supporting Actress Award, not Lead Actress, and she wins for Mrs. Miniver. So this must have been a great night for her to win an Oscar herself, but then to also have her co-star winning in this same category that she was nominated in. So Teresa Wright, she was in a few stage productions before she was hired in Hollywood, and her first film was The Little Foxes, which we talked about last week, and she got her first Oscar nomination for that. Pretty incredible that her first 3 movies she gets Oscar nominations for and a win, and then her fourth movie is Shadow of a Doubt, which she's probably even more well known for. So she has a fantastic start to her career. I was looking at what her reputation was at the time, and apparently she was known for, this is a quote, her thorough preparation and quiet professionalism, according to directors who worked with her. Does that track?
Yeah, that seems about right.
Yeah. So in The Pride of the Yankees, she's playing Eleanor Gehrig, who was the wife of the famous baseball legend Lou Gehrig, and the film is about him and his career, but it also touches on his personal life with Eleanor and how she always supported him no matter what, including through what would ultimately be the last year of his life when he was diagnosed with a terminal illness. This is another addition to this list that I have going, which is called What If There Was a Wife? She is very much the supportive wife.
She is.
And between the 5 nominees here, she has by far the least amount of screen time, and that's because the story isn't really about her.
Yep.
I mean, the film does give her a handful of moments where we see things from her perspective, but by and large, this is the Lou Gehrig story, with Lou Gehrig, I should mention, being played by Gary Cooper. So what do we think of Teresa Wright here? And also, I just have to ask, is she in the right category?
Lead, debatable. It takes a while for her to show up in this movie.
About 30 minutes.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been watching the films that we're talking about for this past week, and my boyfriend's kind of popped in and out. And he knew that I was watching stuff to do with the 1942 Oscars, and he was like, "Oh, what's the specifics of the podcast?" And I explained it, and then he talks about Pride of the Yankees. He goes, "Best Actress." Actress lead?
Yeah.
And I was just like, yeah, then.
Her?
Yep. He's like, the wife? The wife? I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, is from a perspective of category fraud and like, screen time, is it lead? Debatable. I think, is she the biggest female role in the film? Yes. Technically, yes. And it's also, it's weird because it's, she's clearly in supporting for Mrs. Miniver, so it's not a case of like, well, she can't be in supporting, she's too big of a star. It's not quite that. I think it has a lot to do with the fact of, she's supporting in that film, so it's lead in this one. Although I don't know if they thought about that as much then in the way that they would now, but, taking that out of consideration, I do really like her in this. She's very charming. I like her a lot on screen. Obviously, we'll kind of touch on her a little bit with Mrs. Miniver. I'm also a big fan of her in Shadow of a Doubt and another film that we had talked about before, Best Years of Our Lives.
Yeah.
I think she's very charming. I think her and Gary Cooper have really nice chemistry. It's a very like basic, no problems romance, outside of, no problems as in like they get along very well and they love each other. But I still found it very sweet and charming, even if it is very basic. Like I don't know. It just, I'm very sentimental about that sort of thing. And so it kind of, it's one of those things where even if it's not the most groundbreaking, nuanced, interesting romance, it's still, it hits a nerve. And I think she
that's valid.
sells those scenes very well. I think she also sells the drama of the last act of the film very well. I really liked her performance. I don't rank it as high in the nominees, mostly because of her screen time. But on the whole, I do like it.
Nice. Well, this performance for me, it's not bad. And I get why she was nominated, especially because the Oscar voters love this kind of role from women. And she's quite charming and likable. Nothing she's doing here for me I would consider great acting.
No.
Just because she fulfills the role that was assigned to her and she has pretty good chemistry with Gary Cooper. That doesn't really mean to me, wow, what a performance.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said,
she did her job.
She's very charming. Yeah. I emphasize
I don't deny that.
Charming, where it's not like, oh, it's a great, whereas I feel like, her in like Shadow of Doubt, it's like, oh, that's a good performance.
Right.
Interesting character.
Yeah. She does what is required of her. She does have that extra charm, I think, where I would say you are rooting for this couple, which is good. But there's really nothing special to what she does here for me that I haven't seen from dozens of other actresses. And this is another example here of not so great material, and the nature of the role doesn't allow for that much exploration of the character. And honestly, not even that much of a defined personality either.
Yeah.
So it's partly her not really elevating the material enough for me, but also the material being so basic compared to everyone else here that it's hard to be really impressed with what she's doing enough to say Oscar nomination.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, just because I enjoy her and the performance, it's not one that I would watch and go, oh, I would nominate that. Like, no, I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, she finally shows up about 30 minutes into the film. She's introduced as a fan in the stands, and we see Lou Gehrig tripping over a bunch of bats, and she's laughing at him and calling him Tanglefoot. And he sort of gives her a dirty look, and she kind of gives him one back and is kind of sassy. And yeah, I mean, I do think that they're cute together. Like, it's very white bread Americana kind of cute, but they do complement each other well. And I will say this for Gary Cooper, for me, he doesn't always work well with certain actresses, even that I've talked about so far on this show, such as Marlene Dietrich. But here, I think they really do seem like a couple who would be attracted to each other.
Yeah.
Like, it really seems like they're on the same wavelength.
Yeah, it's a romance that really works. And a lot of the film, I think, hinges on that. And so I think that in that respect, I think they both succeed at that.
Yeah. It's, they seem to find the same kinds of things funny. So yeah, they're able to make that work. There's the scene at the restaurant where they're really starting to get to know each other for the first time, and it's this sort of meet cute stuff, and she slips on the floor and she says they're even, but that's charming. I mean, she's quite luminous, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
um and she does at least bring that to the character. And if this is a film from his perspective mostly, then you definitely get what he sees in her. And one other scene I actually wanted to point out in terms of the first half of the movie is when he's on the field and she's in the stands and they're sort of making eyes at each other and he's losing his concentration. We see a shot of her smiling, and then it transitions to a firework.
Yep.
And the next scene is them at a carnival. This has nothing to do with her performance at all, but I just like how that transition really shows her to be like this exciting sort of light in his life. And I just thought that was very well done, just saying.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So I also just wanted to point out there's like an extended scene of them at a club after that, watching like singers and dancers and performers.
They go on so long. I mean, they get their own
I was gonna
credits.
say, like, what does this have to do with anything?
Well, my boyfriend came home in the middle of that scene, and I texted him earlier. I was like, "Oh, I'm watching the Lou Gehrig biopic." He looks and he goes, "This is the baseball movie?" And I was like, they're on a date, Ben. We're getting to it.
We're getting there. We're slowly getting there.
Slowly getting.
Yeah, like they finally cut back to them, and it's like, okay, all right. Yeah, but there's that very scene is when we're getting a little bit of her personality coming through, where she's asking about how he must have girls in cities across America. Yeah. So there's that. I mean, I'm sort of picking at like very, very tiny things in this film for her, but
yeah, there's also the scenes with Lou's mother, of them disagreeing over all the furniture. Yes. I felt that in my bones. Like I was just like, you have to stand up for yourself. And it's just like, this is a baseball movie. Doesn't matter what mirror they have.
Yeah, well, actually, that's interesting, is that they sort of pitched this. Sorry, baseball pitch. They sort of pitched this movie as not just a baseball movie, but that it was like a human drama. Like it was about the human spirit. That was what the studio was sort of trying to pitch it as. So that would explain why there's all of these random scenes at home, But yeah, just how much she just cannot contain the aggravation that she feels about her mother-in-law is very real. And there's the scene where she's like frustrated because he's late. I think it's for his birthday, and she's just like perfectly controlled and contained with that little bit of conflict that she has in her, that he's off spending so much time working on what he does for a living. And I think she manages to sort of make all of those little tiny moments that she feels but doesn't really ever express very much. She makes that work pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, they have like their cute little wrestling scene, or they're throwing flowers at each other and really showing them to be so in love. And they eventually end up breaking the news about his disease. And I think this is probably her best scene, where she says, "I'll never let him know I know."
Yeah.
I found that to be quite impactful from her.
Yeah. I read up a little bit on the real life person after the fact, and she never remarried. And she kind of said, like, I had the great love of my life. And it's like, you see that in this film. You really see that, that type of romance, which is so interesting that this film showcased that, when this movie came out a year after he died.
Yeah.
Which is
quick
kind
turnaround.
of insane.
Yeah.
I mean, which is kind of why it probably plays it very, very safe and clean, very cookie cutter.
Yeah, very solemnly, and just, no real rough edges to the Lou Gehrig story.
No really rough edges to like any of it, besides of like, oh, like the guys in the fraternity are kind of mean to him.
Yeah.
And like they don't,
Gently
and like
maintained.
nobody
Yeah.
believes that he'll be a good ball player.
But he'll show
Yeah.
them. Yeah. So really the last scene that she has is of her like putting on a fake mustache and pretending to be an announcer, trying to cheer him up, and they're really both pretending for each other in a way that I found actually quite moving in the end. And then she just breaks down crying. Yeah, it's a real emotional high point that both of them really play very well. But again, I don't know if it's enough, all things considered. So that's that. The New York Times said Teresa Wright has a lovely, gracious quality as Mrs. Liu. I mean, sure.
Yeah.
Um, she does. She's very luminous. She does have that gracious quality to her that I can understand why a certain segment of the Academy would be like, we like her.
Yeah, but I think she won for the right performance.
Yes, correct. All right. Greer Garson, Mrs. Miniver. Okay, so here we have her winning on her third nomination, and I think this is a culmination point for Greer at this point in her career, even though she had only been in Hollywood for a few years. We'll touch on more of why she won in a little bit, but this was adapted from a book, and it's a pretty juicy part. It's about a British family, and they're living pretty happily in the years before World War II, and then they really just have their foundation rocked when the war does hit. And Greer is playing Mrs. Miniver herself, Kay Miniver, who is the matriarch of the family. Walter Pidgeon plays her husband, and they have 3 kids. One of them is going off to war, so she spends a lot of time worrying about him. And a lot of the film is about her carrying on with her daily life and doing her best not to become too overcome with emotion. There's a subplot where this local man names a rose after her. He calls it the Mrs. Miniver Rose. At one point, she has an interaction with a Nazi. It has a little bit of an episodic feeling, but it's largely about the human spirit and carrying on in the midst of all this turmoil. And this is a part that Greer Garson did not want at first, despite the fact that it was practically tailor-made for her in every way possible. She was pretty hesitant about the idea of playing a mother of an adult son. Like, that was a hang-up she had. She read the book and she said she didn't like some of the changes made to the movie, but ultimately, here she is. She took it and then had a kind of miserable time on set because the director, William Wyler, was such a perfectionist that it drove her crazy, but she made it work. She won the Oscar. Worked out pretty well for her in the end. So yes, let's talk about our winner here. How familiar were you actually with Greer Garson and her whole deal? And what do you think of her here?
So I hadn't seen any of her other, I don't think I'd seen any of her other performances before this, but I knew who she was because I know who all the Best Actress winners are. You know, the first you hear of Greer Garson, she won Best Actress for Mrs. Miniver. And I know the stat about her having the longest Oscar speech.
Yes.
But I known about mostly from hearing your thoughts about her through the podcast, through the old Best Picture series, and now with these ones of being okay with her, but this kind of being the culmination of everything she's good at and whatnot. And I think she's great in this. I think she feels like such a movie star, but in a way where it's not in like a showy way, but in like a very commanding presence. I think the camera loves her. She's so beautiful. I think, I'm a big fan of William Wyler, and I think specifically his like camera work in this, with the framing and whatnot. I think just the way that he shoots her, I think is just really great. I think she just gets so much to do. It's kind of, we'll get to it. It's hard to compare. She gets so much stuff to do in this film. She's a very, calm, cool, and collected, likable character until, it's one of those where this movie's very calm and light until it's not, until it's very
Right.
much not. And that kind of almost like bowls you over in how that is.
Mm-hmm.
She gets a lot of these very sweet, nice moments, but then also, the moment with the Nazi, and there's the moment in the bomb shelter with their like two younger kids, and then of course the big
Mm-hmm.
scenes towards the end of the film. I think, she just has such a range of emotions to play with that I think she does very, very well.
Yeah, I agree. I will say I've pretty much been 0 for 2 on Greer Garson nominations so far. She didn't do much of anything for me with Goodbye, Mr. Chips. She was all right in Blossoms in the Dust, but not really nomination worthy. This, I think she is very worthy in. I think this is truly the perfect example of an actress winning for the exact right part at the exact right time, which, I mean, I feel like we even mentioned it in the beginning, doesn't
Yeah.
happen very often at the Oscars. So even though I've been pretty down on Greer thus far in this series, I can at least say that. I can admit that. Does this mean I would vote for her from this lineup? We'll get to that at the end, but I think she's very good here. This is a stiff upper lip part to end all stiff upper lip parts, and she was just the person for the job who could do it best at this point in 1942 in Hollywood. She's very put together, very much containing her emotions. I would also say that even though she has a certain sophisticated quality to her, that she naturally brings that to every part, but there's also a part of her that feels relatable, like an every woman kind of feeling from what she brings here. She's very warm and she's sincere and very earnest, but not in a way that's like too much. Like, she's a very practical woman who is going about her business in a way that, I mean, I can't speak for how women were processing this moment in history at that time with the war approaching and everything, but this story, I feel like, is almost like a guide for how to process these feelings of powerlessness that you might have, and how you can still make an impact in a positive way in your own little community. And I feel like the film almost makes her into a role model in some ways, in like how to live your life in these more troubling times. I know I'm kind of jumping ahead here with probably giving reasons why she won, but I think that's a big part of it, that she really excels at playing these noble women who are just naturally good people who are fighting for the right causes and they're on the right side of history. And I feel like, yeah, I mean, like the way she's even framed in this film is almost like she's a saint in a way. And, you know, a lot of this can sound kind of over the top, but I think she plays that in a way that still feels very real and very naturalistic. So it's not like annoying. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
no, I agree. And I think also she has great chemistry with everybody else she acts with. I really like her relationship with her husband in the film, of like they just love each other, and it's just a very like
Yeah.
good, nice marriage.
Right.
I think there's the scene where they're in the bomb shelter and they're talking about their son's cat, and she says something of just like everybody should have something that they love, and she kind of like squeezes his hand.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
just like a very like, it's a very simple portrayal. There's not really much conflict as far as like, anything with their relationship, but they're just like, it's just an aspect of the story that I found kind of refreshing. I feel like so many like films of this time, it's like, these like shitty husbands
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
that it was just like,
Believe me,
oh,
I've been through a lot of them
they're
there.
just nice. That's a
Yeah,
lot of the
they
people in
are.
this movie. It's just like at the end, like, I mean, that's kind of the, a big theme of it, of like community
Yeah.
and stuff. And
Right.
I feel like that definitely comes across.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is also one of these performances where there's not a whole lot to talk about and single out in terms of like, here's this thing that she does in this scene, and look at how it differs from this other scene. Like, it's a lot of these smaller moments, like you even mentioned, and the gestures, like when she's finally able to take a breath and relax when she realizes that her son is still alive. And she's playing this very level-headed woman who has gone through a lot of stuff by the end of the film, but she is really keeping it pretty cool, calm, and collected. And she's really the only stable force in the film. And, you know, this is where it can tread into the territory of this not even feeling like you're watching a performance. She just feels like a real person who doesn't really have all of the classic sort of old Hollywood affectations and problems, where I feel like another actress taking on this part would maybe try to oversell a lot of the more emotional moments here, but she's just very composed. And I don't know, I mean, I realize this might sound a little hyperbolic, but I feel like watching her here, it's like you feel like you're in good hands.
Yeah.
Because she's just keeping it all together. And then therefore we as an audience, or like we as a country, as people in England or in America, like we can get through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, that's when we think about the context of this being World War II era, it makes a lot of sense that this story really resonated with people.
Yeah, completely.
I remember mentioning on the Best Picture series when I covered this year, I made the comparison to Olive Kitteridge, which was a miniseries with Frances McDormand, and she's definitely playing a very different, like curmudgeon kind of character there, but it just weirdly struck me in a similar way. Like this is about one woman who is this kind of grounding force for people in her community that people are just strangely sort of drawn to. And you see it with the way in this film how like Henry Travers looks at her and names the rose after her, or in these scenes with her family and her husband, or with the Nazi soldier, which I think is a big standout for her, the way she controls that scene. She just has a magnetism, I think, that is pretty powerful here, and not really in a lot of the other films that I've seen from her, to be honest, but I think they managed to just capture the right kind of character for her here.
Absolutely.
So just behind the scenes, I don't know if you knew about this aspect, but she started up a romance, Greer Garson, with the actor who played her son in the film. Yes, Richard Ney. And they were together for 4 years.
Wow.
She was very much advised against this, especially when Mrs. Miniver was getting bigger. But look, it clearly didn't affect much of anything with her Oscar chances.
Yeah, clearly.
Or even that much with her career. But apparently it wasn't like a very happy marriage, and they divorced a few years later. But just an interesting tidbit. They actually aren't too different in ages. I think it's like about 10 years.
Okay.
But still, when if you know this and then you're watching the film, it's a little bit like, oh boy.
Kind of glad I didn't know that until after the fact.
Yes.
Yeah, because I spent most of the time being like, oh, is this guy in other movies? I like him. He's cute.
Yeah, he didn't really do that much else, actually. But do you have anything else of note for Greer before we get into why she won?
No, I think that's about it.
Yeah. Well, for this Oscar race, we had last year's Best Actress winner, Joan Fontaine. She had some thoughts on this race, let me tell you. Yeah. I was reading an Inside Oscar. She really had some things to say. She said, I believe Greer Garson should and will win. I do not, however, feel Katharine Hepburn should win. She belongs to the stage. Awarding the honor is an industry matter. Bette Davis's work in Now Voyager is a triumph, but then there couldn't be the thrill for Bette as there is for an actress who had never won the award, which is probably true. But my goodness, this shade towards Katharine Hepburn, I was shook.
God.
I'm just like imagining an actress saying this about a current Best Actress race. Like, here comes Olivia Colman, and she has some thoughts to say about Renee Zellweger. The sass of old Hollywood is always fun to look at. But yeah, this is an interesting combination of actresses here. To be honest, there wasn't much of a race because Greer Garson was very much out in front as soon as this film became a hit. And there was really no anyone as an alternative, really, which would make this series interesting when we get to the end here for who was the runner-up. But why do you think she ended up winning here?
Well, I mean, even if, even taking out the fact that the film also wins Best Picture, and all the other things that it wins, I think it's just so clearly the winner. She's the title role. It's this harrowing portrayal of World War II, what they're going through right now. It's a very likable character, and very strong and maternal. I think that there's a lot for people to relate to and connect with. And I think it's just like, she is the movie.
She was the moment.
She is the titular role.
Yeah, she really was. That's all right. I mean, she was playing a character who was pretty much impossible to feel negatively about, especially at this time. She was in a film that was a box office hit, that was just adored and was about something, capital I important. And she was really at the right point in her career to finally get this crown here. And I was actually reading from this biography on Greer Garson that I picked up for the library that she was adored at this time. And so many magazines and fan polls that rated her as the #1 favorite star of the moment. And she was really just given the royal treatment by the studio and really was cementing herself as the queen of MGM, just like Norma Shearer was, even though Norma Shearer was on her way out. Out with Norma Shearer, here comes Greer Garson. That was very much the feeling. But yeah, I think no one else probably came anywhere close to beating her, especially with the film doing as well as it did, the film winning Best Picture. So yeah, this is a pretty clean cut situation here.
Yeah, I think also just the idea of, you get your first couple nominations and then you get your win. Like
they make you wait for it sometimes.
Yeah, it feels, there's just such a number of factors.
Yeah. We should also just mention her Oscar speech, which was apparently 5 minutes and 30 seconds long. Longest speech in Oscar history because they didn't have like playoff music at this time, so they just let people go on for however long. They actually weren't televised at all, so it's not like they needed to worry about commercials.
The internet would kill her now.
Yes. I mean, we've seen this with a few different recent examples, like at the Emmys, like Scott Frank going on, and everyone's like, "Get him off the stage!" So this whole thing sort of became like a urban legend in terms of just how long she was speaking. Like some people thought it was like a full hour that she was on stage.
Can you imagine?
She's just like filibustering up on the stage. But there isn't actually a full transcript of everything she said, but I did recently tweet it, parts of her speech that were sort of cut out, and it's just it's everything. She's talking about so much. She's talking about nominations and how those are really the reward, and she's like making a reference to Alice in Wonderland, like it's going all over the place.
Oh god.
So that's Greer. Who else but Greer? Let's dive into some of these Twitter questions. Yes. All right. This is from Mark Lamb, who said, "Do you like Bette Davis better in the masochistic roles like Now Voyager and The Nanny, or the dominant ones like Jezebel and All About Eve?"
I think there's good balance too. I think that's why I liked so much about the Now Voyager performance, was that it's so different from anything else. But I still love those other ones. I think there's also just more of those devilish ones. That's the thing.
Right.
But
what's funny is that, like, when I was first discovering Bette Davis, I would have definitely said the more dominant ones. But now in this specific context of doing this show and just like mainlining so many of her performances, I do have a newfound appreciation here for the ones where she does take more of a risk and isn't in the role of like, I'm a bad bitch. Like,
Yeah.
so I'll say generally speaking, the dominant ones I just naturally prefer because that's how I grew to know Bette Davis. But right now, I would say these other ones that are more vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Mark Lamb also asked, Woman of the Year was seen as a proto-feminist film, but is it really? Is Hepburn failing and flailing in the kitchen really funny anymore? Is the movie's POV actually anti-Hepburn?
I mean, it's funny in the sense of it's insane, but from a gender roles perspective, it's a little behind the times.
You could say that. Yeah. I think it aspires to be taking shots at both sides and making it equal, but in execution, I feel like there's not even that much that Spencer Tracy's character has to change compared to her. So
yeah, it's one of those where, like, in hindsight and from a modern lens, it kind of feels quite not feminist.
Yeah. Last one from Mark Lamb. Did Hepburn's non-win for the Philadelphia story give her an edge this year as a makeup award like Davis's Dangerous Oscar? I mean, obviously not enough of an edge.
Yeah, I was going to say. Plus, I think also, like, we'll get to it. We'll get to it.
Okay.
Like, he was runner-up, but I don't know.
I mean, I don't know if there was a big push to get her a second Oscar quite yet.
It's also the public had complicated feelings about her, just how, it was only a couple years before they didn't like her. So it's,
Yeah, and the industry probably felt the same way. But I mean, I do think the Philadelphia story probably helped her get this nomination.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
I'll say that.
It's a bit of afterglow, perhaps. Luke Val said, how certain are we that Rosalind Russell was nominated as a consolation for being overlooked for His Girl Friday?
I mean, that would make sense.
Yeah, I would say we can't really be certain of anything, especially from this long ago. But like with Katharine Hepburn, like the goodwill from that previous performance probably did carry over into why she was at least given a bit of a campaign here for this movie. Yeah. This is from our friend Fritz. Without Mrs. Miniver, would Teresa Wright have gone supporting for Yankees?
It's hard to say because it is like, it's not a lead, but it would be a lot bigger than a lot of other supporting roles.
Yes. I honestly don't think so. I think in a world where Greer Garson is in lead for Goodbye, Mr. Chips.
Yeah.
The idea was that Teresa Wright was the female lead of the Pride of the Yankees, which is what you were kind of saying earlier, and was emerging as this potential star performer kind of thing. So I think she would have probably stayed in lead.
Yeah.
And then she wouldn't have an Oscar, probably. Yep. So there you go. But this is also from Fritz, related to the Pride of the Yankees. Should Eleanor just have kicked her mother-in-law out?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, honestly, when you look at it, like, this lineup has so many older women who think they know best, and they're just intruding on the lives of these younger people, and they really don't.
Weirdly enough, the only smart one is the grandmother and my sister Eileen.
That's true.
Who like convinces the dad to be like, no, they should go. They should go follow their dreams.
Yeah.
She's okay.
Christoph said Teresa Wright received 3 Oscar nominations, including 1 win for her first 3 on-screen performances, but not a single additional nomination after that. Why did the Academy lose interest in her?
I think it maybe just came down to the types of films. I mean, like we'd said with Shadow of a Doubt, Hitchcock films were very hit or miss with Oscars, particularly performances. Oh, yeah. And then, like, something like Best Years of Our Lives, she's not the standout performer or even, the standout role in a film like that, regardless of how
Yeah.
successful that film was at the Oscars. Like, same goes with like Myrna Loy in that film. Like, they didn't go for the actresses in that film, regardless of how big of an Oscar success that film was.
Right. Yeah, I think that's all true. I was also doing some reading on this just to see if there was like something concrete for that. And I found out about how she had a falling out with Samuel Goldwyn and her contract was canceled. And part of that led to her getting a salary decrease. And she was in a number of films that weren't very successful. So I don't know. I think she just wasn't really able to transition to a stage in her career that was satisfactory for Academy members. Like, she wasn't making the kinds of movies that the Academy would gravitate to.
Yeah.
But look, she got 3 nominations and she won at a very young age. So I'm sure she was fine. Fritz said, was Greer Garson one of the surest winners in Oscar history?
I would say so.
Yeah. I mean, if this terminology was used back in the day, we would definitely be calling her a lock. Yeah. So, yeah, again, that's the issue with figuring out like who the runner-up is, because I feel like she was so far out in front and had absolutely everything going for her that, yeah, we'll see what we say by the end. Sue Ellen Rossi said, been watching Garson's films in prep for these podcasts, was never wowed by Garson's Miniver, and frankly the rest of her work is the same. She's stoic, matronly, way too perfect. Am I in the minority here, or is she a product of a time when audiences needed that image?
I mean, I can't speak for her other performances. Yeah, she is very, prim and perfect.
Yeah.
But I found something likable and charming of her in this film. I think also, the stakes are a bit higher in this one, of
exactly.
And there are moments, in that second half where it is like, you actually feel like she's in danger.
Yeah.
And so I think those aspects of it work. But again, I can't speak to, her other performances and how it compares in that respect.
Yeah, I would say not really in the minority with what Sue Ellen is saying here. I'm very much of a similar opinion, other than the thing of not finding her to be that impressive in Mrs. Miniver. I do think she's impressive. I just think she was an actress that was very dependent on that specific point in time, and the idea of a noble woman who has dignity and class, and I don't know how much she really went against that image, so that may be part of why she doesn't translate as well today. I think part of it is also just that she's so serious, and not in a way that's like super impressive in that seriousness, like with what Bette Davis was able to do, and that's what can make her films kind of dull to watch at times. So that's what I would say. Will said, Norma Shearer was the first pick for Mrs. Miniver, but turned it down. Based on what you've seen of her, how do you think she would have been in this role? Could she have potentially scored a 7th nomination or 2nd win had she taken the part?
You're probably more of the expert on this. What I will say is it feels kind of like the role where no matter who plays it, it's getting a nomination.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it would have been somewhat similar, but I think with Norma, I think now having seen all of her nominations, I think she would probably lean into that earlier style of acting when they were transitioning from the silence to the talkies, and a little too expressive and over the top. I mean, definitely would have been in the conversation for a nomination. Not sure if she would have won for this, though. I'm not as sure. The other question that Will had is, Greer Garson is sort of thought of as taking over where Norma Shearer left off as the Queen of MGM. How do their roles and careers compare? Whose Oscar win do you prefer? Like I've been saying, the two of them share a lot of similarities with taking on the more prestige-y pictures and also sometimes being dull in their styles. And I've talked about feeling kind of hot and cold on Norma. She really did impress me with Marie Antoinette, which I think is honestly better than anything I've seen from Greer Garson, including Mrs. Miniver. So there's that. I think I actually do prefer Norma at this point because at least we saw some nice range for her in a lot of her performances, whereas with Greer, she has a few exceptions, but I'd say is so even keeled to the point of not even really being that fun to watch. So that's my perspective. And let's see. Sophia Simonello said, based on performance alone, should Greer have been nominated for Random Harvest instead? I know it was never going to happen, but I'd take that wild musical number over her in Miniver any day.
I still haven't seen Random Harvest, so I cannot speak on that one. But I remember you liking
Yep.
it from what I remember.
Yes, I did. Yes. This is one of the exceptions that I was talking about where she does have a fun musical number and it's showing some personality. So there's that. Yeah, I remember really enjoying Random Harvest. It's not super fresh right now, but yeah, I think I might prefer her there. Gordon at Mark Wahlberg said, if Casablanca had been eligible in this year instead of the following year, would Ingrid Bergman have been nominated here? If so, who would she have knocked out, and could she have been a threat to win?
She should have been nominated if it was eligible for this year. Who would she have knocked out? I guess Rosalind Russell.
Yeah.
Even though, like, obviously we said the stuff about Teresa Wright's, screen time, I feel like that was a bigger film and she was like having a moment.
Yeah. I think she would have knocked out Rosalind Russell. It's very tempting to say Teresa Wright because the part is small, but yeah, they loved the Pride of the Yankees, so I don't think that was happening. But I don't know if she would have won because we assume Greer Garson's there too.
Yeah.
The last bunch of questions is all the other sort of snub questions, like Andrew Carden is asking about Jean Arthur in The Talk of the Town. Kay Flea said Simone Simon for Cat People. Gabe Garin and Stanny Homie said Carol Lombard in To Be or Not to Be. Veronica Lake in one of her movies. So just the sort of general question of wanting us to talk about any of those performances, any of those that you've seen that you wanted to highlight?
I don't have any opinions on those ones, unfortunately. The one that was like of that year that I would have nominated that wasn't mentioned there, but is Claudette Colbert in The Palm Beach Story.
Yes.
That's a good screw. I think would have fit the screwball comedy slot a bit better than some of the others, personally.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take any opportunity to talk Jean Arthur.
I was going to say, that's your gal.
Yes, that's my gal. You know the answer is yes whenever it comes to Jean Arthur for me in terms of, like, should she have been nominated. This and The More the Merrier really go hand in hand for me. We'll be talking about that in the next episode, which was her only nomination. But yeah, Talk of the Town, really fun. She's opposite Cary Grant and Ronald Colman. She gets to do a lot of great physical comedy. I mean, this is a lineup that I could take or leave a few of them, so I'd gladly put her in, or Claudette Colbert, or, Carol Lombard. That's her last performance because she died this very year in 1942. This was her last performance. So what else? I mean, this Simone Simon question for Cat People, I was never going to come anywhere close to a nomination, I don't think, because I mean, it was a B movie and I don't think they were ever going to touch that. But I will say this about that Simone Simon performance. I've truly never seen anyone look more like an actual cat on screen in my life. Just throwing that out there. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Yeah, one more here just from Marcel, which is just, which of the two nominated Teresa Wright performances do you prefer?
I think you'll probably agree with this. I would think the Mrs. Miniver performance.
Yep. Correct.
I think it's also just an interesting supporting win. I feel like we don't get a lot of like ingenues in supporting in that way. And again, I think that shows a lot of the things that she does in Pride of the Yankees well. Very charming, kind of that like tit for tat type of thing she's got. And then also, of course, the more like somber, painful scenes towards the end. She gets a lot to do.
Yeah, she gets much more to do, ironically, in her supporting performance than her lead performance. But it is what it is. The other question that they had is, do you think Mrs. Miniver would have won if it came out after Casablanca instead of before?
Yeah. Yes. Uh,
Yeah.
if it was the same year,
Um, yeah, I think that's what that means.
oof,
I think Mrs. Miniver, if they're in the same year, I think Mrs. Miniver wins.
yeah, and then it would have been something that,
Yeah.
people would have had a lot of feelings about.
Yes.
Would have been
Much
a
like
How Green
How
Is My
Green Is My
Valley. Yep.
Valley and Citizen Kane. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's the end of our questions here. Thanks everyone again. Let's jump into our final segment where we will discuss who we think the runner-up was, because I don't have a concrete answer for this, but I will gladly let you take the lead here.
I think it was Bette Davis, even though
Okay.
she already had won twice. She was
Yes.
clearly beloved by the Academy as far as nominations. I think the film was more liked than some others. I think that while like The Pride of the Yankees was probably more popular, I don't think Teresa Wright was coming close to it, because I don't think they would give her two in the same night. I just don't think that was going to happen. I think, I don't think it was going to be Rosalind Russell, and I don't really think it was going to be Katharine Hepburn either. So I think it's just by process of elimination. Plus, I think the strength of the performance, the uniqueness within her filmography, and I think just, the range and vulnerability that she shows in that performance, I think that's where I end up personally. It also probably doesn't hurt that it's my favorite of the four.
Yeah.
But, the film was liked enough, and she was obviously liked enough at this time, that I think that's where I land on that.
Yeah. I think that I agree. I think I would say Bette Davis of the other four is the likeliest, even though I think, Greer Garson probably got 90% of the votes, would be my guess. But with Bette Davis really showing a new side to her that we hadn't seen in a while, at least of her nominated performances, I think there was something exciting there, and she definitely was very popular at this time. She was just the president of the Academy the year before, so she was very popular with her peers, and she had come close to winning her third for Dark Victory a few years previously, and I feel like this is one that they would have felt comfortable with giving her a third one for, but Greer Garson is here, so they couldn't.
Exactly.
But in terms of anyone else, yeah, I think by process of elimination, the other three do have so many negatives, I think, that they probably couldn't quite make it. I mean, weirdly, I could almost imagine Teresa Wright being more likely than Katharine Hepburn and Rosalind Russell in a strange way, even though she doesn't have as much. Just the sheer popularity of that movie and them wanting to give her an Oscar and supporting, at least, might have helped her get a few votes here. But yeah, in this particular year, it's like the runner-up got like 2 or 3% of the vote, probably. So final question: who would you have voted for from this lineup?
As much as I just praised Bette Davis's performance just now, and it's very close, Greer Garson edges out, and that's just how I'm feeling today. I think as time goes on and repeat view, again, this was my first viewing of all of these films, I just was struck by how commanding she was in Mrs. Miniver, while also, this very warm maternal presence that's also very controlled and grounded. It's a very movie star performance that also feels incredibly human and honest. And I think it was just one that really stuck with me. It's not, making my 10 favorite wins of all time necessarily, but I think that, I can see why she won from both the perspective of the time with which it came out and, the popularity of the film, and also just the performance in general.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's the people in 1942 were seeing them all for the first time then. Yeah. So, yeah, you're just like them in this case. But I imagine even if like you were in the context and watching all of these actresses growing with these performances, I feel like you would be even more taken with what Greer Garson does here. So it's interesting for me, though, because, you know, I've seen 3 of these before and they were rewatches, and the 2 that were new didn't really impress me enough to want me to give them the win. All due respect to both Katharine Hepburn and Rosalind Russell. For me, just the way that I saw so much new in what Bette Davis did on this rewatch that I didn't even see before, having seen it before, that's part of why I would want to give her the win for this. Yeah, in this year. And actually, looking back, this would be the first win that I would give Bette Davis. So congrats. In my own personal estimation of the Oscars, this is an overdue win for Bette Davis. Yes. So there you go. We'll see if she gets more wins down the line, but Bette Davis is officially taken care of as far as my own trajectory. But yes, thank you so much, Casey. This was another very fun episode. I always love hearing your thoughts. So
thank you so much for having me. It's always the best time.
And tell the people where they can find more of you on the internet.
You can find me writing and podcasting over at nextbestpicture.com, and I'm on Twitter at Casey Lee Clark.
And thank you all for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the podcast is at Oscar Runner Up on Twitter. I'm on Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/AndTheRunnerUpIs, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes, including several with Casey Lee Clark here. And that's it for February. And in the first week of March, we'll be tackling the 1943 Best Actress race. The nominees there were Jean Arthur for The More the Merrier, Ingrid Bergman for Whom the Bell Tolls, Joan Fontaine for The Constant Nymph, Greer Garson for Madame Curie, and Jennifer Jones for The Song of Bernadette, with the winner being Jennifer Jones. So that's what to watch. Thanks again, Casey.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll bid you all adieu.